I mean, overall, I'll just say that our goal is to transform it from child protective, child welfare system to a child well-being system. And there's some things that can happen on the front end that invest in families on the front end and strengthening their financial supports. And then on the back end as well, too, that doesn't, generally when you remove a child from the home, they actually end up in an economically less well-off circumstance than the one they left, particularly. I will just say that we have, I think I'll just skip this part. A lot of this is, we do a lot of work in K-12 funding and state budget that I mentioned, and it's primarily the work of the Arizona Center of Economic Progress now, as we decided to start, what I mentioned was that affiliate organization under 501c3 to envision a different way in which we look at economic investments in this state. K-12 funding, if anyone read the paper or saw Governor Hobbs' State of the State or her budget proposal, which was put out yesterday, we're thrilled at some of the ideas that she's proposed in that, and I think I'll just leave it at that. I was going to talk a little bit about our legislative priorities, but I've been talking a super long time and they get very specific. So I might just pause and say that we have a list of legislative priorities and bills that we will try to get through, and we'll do our best. The legislature is neat. First of all, everybody's new, right? I think like 90-80% of the legislature is new and they're learning the ropes. The leadership is going to be challenging to move a budget through and to move some spending through. So to the degree that it's nice that Governor Hobbs, being a former social worker and trained in social work, understands prosperity in the sense of investing in services and programs for families. And so to the degree that we can get things done administratively, we're going to work pretty hard to get some things done administratively as well as some of our legislative priorities. So I have a whole number of slides that include our legislative priorities. But I also, as I was looking through them, I was like, oh yeah, but that was in her State of the State, and that was in her budget proposal. And so it's just really nice to see that we might be able to go at this a couple different ways.
The only thing I would add to yours is it's Arizona Democratic governor. Katie Hobbs.
Historic.
It's Democrat.
Yeah. Have you heard any petitions or anything coming up that we could help support to remove that outdated?
Yeah, that was what I wanted to talk about, but I always felt like I was running long in the tooth here a little bit. I will just say that Senator Gobledon is amazing representative. You're lucky to have her, you represent her, or her represent you in the legislature. We do legislative meet and greets, and I was just talking with her on Thursday. She was part of a group of legislators that came and heard our priorities and also got to say, look, this is what we're focusing on in the coming session. And just her background in terms of early childhood, things first, like she just really very quickly gets that as well too. So there's particular bills, but I can almost tell you she'll be like 10 feet ahead of you in terms of
She usually
supporting.
sends me the list, but yeah, if you've got anything special, do let us know.
Well, I could go through all these slides, but I don't want, there's 10 more and I don't want to do them. But let me just say about the aggregate expenditure limit. Does everybody know what that is? It's essentially, it was an initiative passed in the 80s by farmers. And so it's based on what education looked like in the 80s, which didn't involve technology or, trying to prepare people for 21st century or, all that kind of stuff. I mean, it's a very different environment, let's just say right now. Basically, what happened in the last legislative session, just to make this super short, is they came up with a budget deal to give schools additional dollars, desperately needed dollars. As part of that deal, they're supposed to come back after election time and permanently raise the aggregate spending limit. So this is not new money. We're talking about schools already have this money. Your local school districts already have this money. Because that didn't happen and because the previous governor, Governor Ducey, reneged on that deal and that promise, we are facing a March 1st deadline that if the legislature doesn't come in and temporarily essentially what they're going to do is it's a two-part fix. You have to waive it for the upcoming year because we don't have time to send it to the voters. But you have to, and they did this last time, let's like waive it for this year. Let's get us through a year. So they're going to waive it for a year, but they have to do it before March 1st. And if they don't, if we get into a showdown with this new political situation that we have, I guess things could get very interesting. The governor's proposed a really insightful, well thought out budget, and the response from the Republicans to that budget was, well, we want to just pass a as it is kind of budget. Some of the language that I caught in that statement was that essentially they want to do that, but they also want to allow entities to be able to plan ahead. I think that will help people plan ahead. So I'm pretty sure they're going to attach this to that. Well, we'll just keep. If that doesn't happen, it's like $1.3 billion in between March and May, and that's, you know, you're essentially shutting schools, laying off teachers, sending kids home. It's extraordinary. See what happens with this brinkmanship. And there's lots of organizations and there's lots of bills that have proposed, look, let's waive it for the year. It's no way for schools to operate. And superintendents, hey, we can't do this every year. You know, the money's there. You know, we have to be able to plan our budgets. So we have to fix it permanently, and we'll probably focus primarily on that, like there's different proposals for what it should be as we move forward, and that's something that would have to go to the voters and pass. Hopefully that we don't need to get signatures, that the legislature will refer it to the ballot. I don't know that that's true quite yet. So
We are very good at getting petitions signed. We had 15 in the hopper at one time last year, so
that's awesome.
Another question? Oh. Yes.
So I'm curious if you know the answer to this. I found it interesting also that we spend 50% of our budget on education, yet Arizona is about 7th or 8th from the bottom in terms of how many dollars we pay per student in school. And so what is the average in the United States of the budget spent on education? Do you know where it normally stands?
I don't know the answer to that, but I can explain why it seems like 50% is like this extraordinary number, right? Like they're like, oh, well, we should be pretty good then. And what's happened over the years since the 90s, when I graduated from high school, right, we had a pretty good, well-funded education system. By the time I had children and started taking my kids, I was like, whoa, this is not the public education system that I graduated from. We had really significant tax cuts every single year, except I think one. So if you can think of a pizza pie that is shrinking, it's smaller, not over time because obviously there's more people in the state, but the per pupil share is smaller. So you're talking about a vastly quickly growing state, one of the fastest, that people are coming here for various reasons. And yet the per pupil number and the amount of money is significantly less because of the tax cuts and the tax.
Dollars are less going into, even though the coffers are getting bigger. I get that.
Does that make sense?
So,
I know it's
they're cramming so many kids into one classroom to try and cover the cost, the expenses of education, and they're just busting at the seams. I can't even imagine if they don't fix this in March, you're looking at a 20% decrease in all of public education next year. That's like, I don't even know how that's tolerable in the schools.
It's 30%, but because it's the last few months of the year,
What did you say, 30? I thought it was 18, I'm up to 20, but it's 18%.
But see, because, okay, so it would be that spread over a larger period of time, but since there's only 2 months left, it's just really, like, you just have to very quickly shut down schools or they can't. I mean, the thought is, I think that it's just too crazy to imagine. And
they run so bare bones right now, I just can't even imagine how they're going to get that done.
Yeah, I mean, I think anybody who's volunteered in a classroom or gone into a classroom, no, we do not have adequate funding. Or as a teacher, thank you so much.
Our new member is a teacher.
Everyone has to sweep the floor in the classroom because there are no custodians.
There are no custodians, there are no counselors, there are no nurses, there are no librarians. I mean, it's a very different system than the one, no aides, no You know, art, no music, I mean, it's just, it's
Well, we're paying
really,
the superintendent 6 figures.
Yeah, it's top heavy. Yeah. All right, any other questions that I miss?
Hi. One thing I particularly commend Children's Action Alliance in working on is involving the people who are involved in the system with solving problems, particularly the great aging out teenagers. I remember when that happened. The question or the point I have is, approximately 70% of the cases that go to termination have substance abuse as a factor, and you hadn't mentioned that. And of the cases that are labeled in the neglect box, approximately the same percentage, it isn't, the neglect is related to substance abuse. And
I guess the approach and the way that I would answer that is it's a very complicated circumstance between poverty, you know, stress in the household, mental health, substance abuse, like all these things are like incredibly commingled. And so to say it's substance abuse, it's all sort of interrelated and wrapped around with families. So it's really hard to kind of distinguish, oh, it's a family that's fine except they have a substance abuse issue. They have multiple issues going on in that family that is impacting, right, by definition, that's impacting each of those things. One of the things that, for example, in the Great Recession of 2008, all those like huge cuts, they cut DCS workers, they cut substance abuse, they cut mental health. I mean, they literally just cut everything off very quickly. And so the resulting, I mean, yes, we know that the solution, I guess I would say, is to invest in all those people and all those services to surround a family to create stronger families. Even in those circumstances, the research shows interventions with families is superior, you get superior outcomes with kids though, than removing them from the home, which is incredibly traumatic.
Yeah, when you talked about, talking with Rosanna Gobelin and meeting with the legislators, what came up in my mind was how many Republican legislators are like partners with you in getting any of this done, because let's face it, it's a Republican legislature and it has been for decades. And is this really a solvable problem with the legislature, or should perhaps most of your effort be in educating the voting public so that we get a change in the legislature so that we can actually get something done?
No, and what we like to do all of it. Like part of what we do is educating policymakers, but I just have to thank you guys again so much for inviting me to, get back out here and start doing these presentations. Mobilizing and educating the community is the other half of what we do. It could also be media events as well too with impacted communities. So we do a fair amount of that. So all of our bills, strategically speaking, well, I would say 95% of our bills have Republican sponsors because that's just the reality of the circumstance up until this year. Both houses were Republican, the governor was Republican. We have long-term goals and we would chip away and we get closer and we get closer and we get closer. But if you're talking about huge system reform and changes, it would take a different mindset. And so this is a really historic moment for us, and we're just, God, I have to tell you, just listening to her give her state of the state and see that budget proposal, I just felt so heard. I mean, I didn't get to talk to her directly, but I was like, I was like breathing differently even, right? About, oh, she gets it, right? Like this is what would solve these issues versus the previous strategy is exacerbating and coming up with back end really expensive ways to deal with some of the issues that we advocate on. So I don't know, does that answer your question? We will try to there's a number of things, I didn't go through the legislative priorities, but there's a number of them, like kids care, for example. I'm going to show this to you guys real quick. So for example, Arizona, we want to raise the CHIP for a long time, the kids care eligibility from 200 to 300. It was part of Governor Hobbs' executive budget. She's just, guess what it costs? It was What's the fiscal cost? Like hundreds of no, $20 million.
Yeah.
$20 million because of the federal match, and we haven't done it for years and years and years. But this is kind of like a chart that I would go over this, but you'll see that like other states, I mean, Alabama is a pretty red state, right? Georgia, kind of a little more purple. Louisiana, Montana, West Virginia, they're going ahead and they're taking advantage of the federal latitude and where they set that and how they can pull down federal dollars. And you can see over to the far column, for example, Alabama has 3.5% of their kids uninsured, largely because they're utilizing and leveraging these federal resources differently than Arizona. So we don't feel like we're boxed into something just because we're a red state. Other red states have made the right decision to do the right things for kids. So
You said, your group is nonpartisan, which I get. But do you get, as talking about the Republican situation, do you get invited to speak to the Republican group so they can understand all of this?
Generally I don't often go speak with either Democratic or Republican groups, I'll be honest. I've been invited many times from Legal Women Voters, for example. A lot of classes and sort of civic groups and that kind of stuff. I love that you invited me, I don't mean but generally, or business groups or Rotaries or
Rotary.
Yes.
Another good one.
Rotary's another really good one.
Full of Republicans.
I will say that there are a few moderate Republicans left. It seems like less and less every year that I've been doing. Like I said, all of our bills, and that you saw the list of successes, that was, maybe 20% of them, was Republican sponsors and a Republican governor. I mean, generally, I think we would envision something much more transformative about a family-friendly state, but we are making progress and we are moving there. We wish we were moving quicker though, because we think it would have a better impact, not just on families' lives, but also honestly on the budget, because we're basically cracking this nut in the most expensive way that you could go at it.
We'll finish up with these two questions. Angie, you have a question, and then Helen.
So you're not so much speaking to Republicans, but you're getting them to fund bills? Because I don't understand how in the last 4 years with a Republican governor who bragged about the $1 billion surplus we had, could let our education system come to the point that it might shut down in 3 months. I mean, has anyone ever explained what that's, when you talk to people, what that surplus is supposed to be for?
Yeah, we have different ideas what the surplus is. And I will say, I mean, not to get too partisan, but the minority side of the aisle tends to go towards tax cuts. Like even this year, the first bill that went through committee is about a $600,000 corporate tax cut. And meanwhile, there's a whole bunch of bills to be served. And I mean, like I'm talking about, they're very small. Like if you add up the investments, they're small with huge returns of investment that would transform.
Can you be nonpartisan but show things as far as state money and then what's going to your groups as far as the discrepancy there? It's like the need and that way?
Yeah, we try.
Okay.
Well, and I would say, and I'll get to you, that it was a Republican that held up the budget to keep the education funding in place.
Yeah.
And so he would not vote for that budget until education was approved, but yet then it was a Republican that reneged on it. So thank you, Governor Ducey. Okay.
Yeah. My question is very simple. In terms of using whatever resources may be available, would it be more advantageous to put that money directly in the hands of families or try and improve the services to those families?
How if it was more
The question
specific?
I have is, should the money be directly directed to the individual families who need it, or would it be more advantageous, for example, to use it in services that would maybe educate them, how better to use what resources they had? I just wonder, in a theoretical situation, where you get the most value for what resources are few.
Yeah, when you refer to that money, I assume you mean public funding, and I don't mean to be cagey or anything, but it probably gets more, based on particular circumstances. I will tell you that when I talk with families and I work with families, there's a and I could have made this a slide, but there's been a lot of research done about, okay, here's a basic bare bones budget, what it costs for rent in Pima County, what it costs for childcare, what it costs for transportation, what it costs for food. And if you're working, at minimum wage, there's two ways you can crack that, right? Like you can build a whole system of subsidies and ask that family to run around and get their childcare and their, heating or cooling assistance or income, utility assistance for low income, get a food box, stand in line, like there's a lot, it's a full-time job just to be poor, I guess is what I'm saying, if you're gonna rely on building up a set of subsidies to get to the level of just what we call the self-sufficiency standard. Federal money, yeah, I think there's been a lot of research around things like baby bonds, earned income tax credits. The federal government, very sad to see, they had the child tax credit. I thought it was brilliant that it's not just delivered at tax time on a refund, but like with $300 over the month. That's very real dollars that they could then spend on things like childcare in an inflationary period, right? Like allowing them to use it for what they needed. And I think that would have been amazing if we could have continued that. Hopefully those in federal government will get that. I know the advocates are still working to get that restored, but I think the statistic is that child poverty, and I'm not talking sufficiency. Sufficiency is closer to area median income. It's closer to 300% federal poverty level. Child poverty, kids being raised under 100% federal poverty level, cut in half. So if you think about what families have to go through just to survive, grocery shopping in the 60s and put a certain bucket of items together in her grocery cart, and then you multiply that by 3, and somehow that's supposed to relate to what it costs today. We love what they created. It's like, here's the HUD, data. Here's the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So it's very well figured out for each of those pieces, and it's bare bones. It's like, I don't eat out. I always buy food. I always prepare it at home. It's super bare bones, but did a bunch of advocacy work with Pima County in terms of trying to determine, because that as a local economy, they actually started to put in additional dollars to childcare through a program called PEEPS, and we were trying to figure out, okay, where do we put the income eligibility? And the goal, for example, with childcare is to try to get that to be no more than 7% of a family's income. Like, I think many people have heard this. You don't want your housing and your utilities to be more than 1/3. You don't want your health insurance to be more than 9%. There's definitions of affordability.
And I would love at some point for someone to put together how much money these legislators have chosen because of their belief systems to leave on the table that has consequences on the voters. And I would love to see someone, and I vote that be you. Because you have access to that. You know those numbers for children. And that the children are paying for this. These people that already aren't making enough money because of these same legislators I submit, and it's costing all of us. These children not having enough to eat costs all of us. So even if you don't have a heart, that doesn't even have a consequence on it. So I think that should be put out there. The press used to tell us that. They don't anymore. They've decided to abdicate.
Yeah, and there's certain states, I'm trying to think of the organization that does this, that certain states are giver states and certain states are receiver states based on for every dollar we said to the federal government, do you get more than $1 back or you get less than $1 back? And Arizona gets less than $1. I don't know the exact figure, but we are not very wise about utilizing the federal funds. And, you know, Governor Hobbs even talked about, you know, in a lot of her speeches about fully utilizing available federal funds for, you know, community home-based programs. I mean, there's a lot of that, and I think she really gets it as well. I will just add one more thing, if I can, kind of to both of that. One of the things that we find most atrocious, we just wrote a memo, and we're going to gear up to do some legislation. I don't know if you know this, but TANF, which is the federal funds, kind of to your point, that assists low-income families with a very paltry amount of cash assistance and child care assistance and, you know, all kinds of things. In Arizona has actually been diverted to just pay for the DCS system.
Yeah.
So we are actually using the money that's supposed to be helping families pay for items, right? Particularly very poor families, because you have to be below 131%. I mean, we're talking really low eligibility levels to get the cash assistance, to get the food stamps, to get the, right, all this kind of stuff. They've actually diverted all those funds to just pay for the DCS system. So it's paying for, essentially, there's no general funds in that, right? Like it's just TANF funds. You could be paying for childcare. You could be strengthening families and getting us, using those funds as many states have done to create supports and family-friendly policies, and instead it's funding the system that basically takes kids from homes.
Yeah.
I would,
Okay, here. And I want to encourage everybody to go to the website.
You're standing in the way.
We have a website. I have my cell phone here. We send out policy updates. We're super wonky about all of these things. So like emerging issues, you can just get the action alerts.
yeah, just take a picture of that real quick and then you can go, thank you for telling me.
It's like, here's things if you want to get involved, find your legislator. You could,
Michelle,
Just a
go
second.
back to your previous slide.
I'll leave this up. You guys can come up. But we have advocacy toolkits on the website. We have Find Your Legislator. We have Request to Speak. We have district fact sheets, which are actually not yet done because, you know, they changed all the districts, so we have to do a lot of work around that too. And feel free to contact me anytime. I run a group called the Southern Arizona Advisory Committee, which is made up of professionals that work with kids and families in each of those areas, and then folks who feel inspired to get involved and make changes, just children's and kids. Maybe it's because of their own personal experiences, interest to you.
Let's give Michelle a big hand. Thank you for being here.